Don't put much thought into cybersecurity. You know, your network connections, the pages you visit, the files you download. You should be thinking about these all the time. Welcome to And Security for All. Your host is Kim Hakem. We're here to help you understand, in general terms, how and why your cybersecurity should be kept in check. Now, here is Kim Hakem.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to And Security for All. I'm Jonathan Kimmitt. I'm filling in for Kim today. She is coming back from a couple of great events, and so she asked me to cover, and I'm really excited. I'm really excited to talk to our guest today. Before we get started, I want to let you know about some upcoming events. They just finished FutureCon Seattle on Wednesday, I believe, and we've got Montreal on the 6th and Omaha on the 19th of April. So we've got some great events. I myself am going to try to hit several events this year. My new job has given me a little bit more flexibility on doing that, so I'm really excited. There are always great events. Kim always does a great job, so I'm really excited to go out there. So make sure if it's in your area of the country, in your town, that you go and support the events. As always, you can find this episode and other episodes on Voice America Network and on your favorite podcast app, which is how I normally listen. As I am driving back and forth between sites and such, I'll throw on a podcast for an hour. It's a great opportunity to get caught up on the news and caught up on events and things happening in cybersecurity. So today, I'm really excited talking to Steve Winterfeld, who is an advisory CISO for Alkamai. Steve has actually guest hosted And Security for And Security for All. And we're really excited that he's a friend of the show, and we're going to talk about DDoS and a few other topics today. So I'm really excited to bring him on. So Steve, thank you so much for joining us. Give us a little bit of your background and kind of what you do for Alkamai.
So yeah, I started off on defense contracting, having come out of the Army. Quickly realized that that probably wasn't the right fit for me. Went over and was the CISO for Nordstrom Bank. Ended up running a lot of Nordstrom security infrastructure. My wife is still mad we left that discount. I went from there over to Charles Schwab, where I built out threat intelligence and incident response. Two awesome companies, and was lucky enough to come into the third awesome company, Alkamai. And Alkamai is probably best known for our content delivery. We are a $1 billion security company, so we're hoping to be known for that. And recently have moved into the cloud space, so you can perform, secure, or build on Alkamai.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people know Akamai by the name. I do a lot in terms of IP scanning or port scanning or looking at things on the network. And as I'm looking through logs, I see Akamai come up. So, I mean, it is for me, it's a big part of what I do is when I'm looking at things, I see Akamai kind of flow through the logs very quickly. So it's tell me a little bit about the security side of Akamai. What is it that you really want people to remember about that?
So, I mean, we do three kind of I don't want to call them lines of business, but three major groupings or functions. The first is we're going to protect from DDoS, both your infrastructure, your layer 3, 4, and your DNS. So we make DNS go faster, we protect it. So we're keeping you online there. The rest is around how you interact with your customers. So we have that WAF, we have bot mitigation, we have account takeover prevention, customer identification, JavaScript protection from Magecart, customer protection from hijacking, domain protection from spoofing sites that are involved with phishing or other things, and then protecting your employees. We have access control, zero trust access, segmentation. The second part is zero trust. We do microsegmentation and MFA. And so really, whether you're trying to stay online, protect your employees or protect your customers, Akamai is a great partner for a number of different companies.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, the first thing you talked about was DDoS, and I think that's really where I want to start. I mean, you've got an article you recently wrote about DDoS and kind of what to think about on that. But let's start. What is DDoS for the listeners and for the people who are tuning in? What is DDoS and what are the categories of DDoS that we really need to start thinking about?
Yeah, it's interesting. Every time you turn around lately, it feels like there's another record being set. And so when we talk about that, there's recently we'll pick, Google's last announcement of 46 million RPSs, and it's a new record. And first of all, what do all these mean? So if you hear somebody talk about RPS, it's requests per second. And I know that's going against my web infrastructure. Somebody's attacking my web page, my login, some way I interact with users. And so that's kind of that layer 7 attack. The next you'll hear are more around the layer 3, 4 attacks, and that is bits per second. And if you hear bits per second, I'm just trying to overwhelm you. I'm trying to clog the pipes, so much traffic that nobody else can get through. If you hear packets per second, that's the classic where I'm trying to overload your systems. So many requests that the CPU can't keep up. So it's less about the pipe and more about attacking the infrastructure. And then if you hear queries per second, that's attacking the DNS. And again, so DNS is ultimately the GPS. We used to say the phone book, but I don't have a phone book anymore. So DNS is that GPS of the internet telling everybody where to go. So if you take that out, people can't find you, your employees can't find where they're trying to go. And each one of these have different attack environments, different monetizations, and ultimately different records.
What would, again, just trying to kind of get the basics for the audience. When we talk about a DDoS attack, and of course, I've been on the receiving end. My organization has, and we've had to defend against DDoSs. What do most users experience when that is happening, both from a customer side, so customer facing, if they're trying to access a service that is otherwise getting DDoS, and from the organization side, what are they going to experience when these attacks happen?
So we'll take it on the, kind of the corporate side first. And let's take an example. Google put out that record I mentioned, 46 million requests per second. Well, that was an attack where people trying to go to Minecraft would have been interrupted and they couldn't get to what their resource was. They wouldn't know why. And so, they're saying, okay, I can't get to it. And I'm going to call the company and say, hey, I can't get to this site. If the company or if Google had alerts in place, they have a playbook, they may know right away what it is. And later on, we'll talk about what they can do about it. But somehow they're going to get alert, either users and or through their, depends on who owns it. Does IT own it? Does security own it? Someone's going to be alerting that we have a problem. And in this case, that attack lasted about 69 minutes. But most of it is a low-level attack. And then over 10 seconds, it went from a low-level attack to a record-breaking attack. But that attack only lasted a few minutes. So again, if I'm a user, I may have been having trouble to get in and then just couldn't get any access at all. And so then I leave because, okay, it's offline, so I'm just going to leave. And that's the big fear during those few minutes it lasted. Now, we hear from Google that this was low impact. So while they hit a new record, their capacity was so high, their countermeasures were so high that they were able to mitigate that attack and the impact to the customer was low. And so that's one of the things, we want to be clear about is not only was there new record set, because that's important to me as a CISO, I need to know what my capabilities to handle a DDoS should be. But ultimately, if the impact wasn't felt by the users, then, I'm not as worried about that.
Yeah, and DDoS protections have grown in the last 10 or 15 years in terms of what they're capable of absorbing. But let's talk a little bit about the actual attackers, DDoS versus a DOS. what does that look like in terms of the attacker doing something? Kind of explain what that DDoS is, from how are they doing it and putting forth so much, either requests or packets, or how do they do that? How do they get that to that organization to cause that interruption?
So there's a couple things, we'll take a typical 3-4 layer attack, and they're increasing both size and complexity. So I would say, back in 2010, the 90% of the attacks were basically coming through, your typical a UDP flood, a SYN flood, a GET flood, a DNS flood, a UDP fragment, ICMP flood. There was just a few major ones. Now, those 5 only represent about 55 of the types of attack. And so they're just, so many types of attack that you have to be a little bit more complex in what your defense is. The next thing was, we used to know, okay, it took them a while to build up. You might see, hours to build up to a peak, and now it's minutes. So people used to be able to have a reaction time. Our DDoS is expensive, so we're only going to turn it on when we need it. That's no longer practical because the speed is so fast. We used to kind of block known bots, but IoT devices getting taken over, a lot of the bots are first time seen because, we're harvesting so many IoT devices to put into our bot networks. And so it is size, it's complexity, it's speed. Talk a little bit about some of the methodologies. You have your big bang. So that Google attack is a big bang, just a new record setting something huge. The next would be, that sophisticated adversary. I'm going to attack you and you're going to use geo blocking. Then I'm going to attack you from a geo you can't block because it's where your customers are, and you're going to try a different defense, and I'm going to try a different attack. And this is going to last, I've seen up to weeks, 17
Wow.
weeks of one persistent adversary going after one customer. And then there's a kind of those short bursts, those coming in a little faster, a little more frequently, trying to interrupt. And an amazing part of all of this is you can go out and buy these services. Everything I'm talking about here is available as a service, which is so true of so much in our criminal ecosystem. It's interesting. Some of these you can buy ransomware, or you can buy a bot for phishing. You can buy something else for DDoS. So just as you know, and I'm sure you're going to share an example as well, as how involved this criminal ecosystem has gotten.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we just came out, I've got customers who are on the hospital space, and I think it was at the end of February that there was a notice to come out for KillNet, specifically, yeah, hitting the health sector, specifically attacking the health organizations and hospitals and things. So talk to us about that. Talk us about the attackers from that organized crime. What are they trying to do? How much money are they getting? Do we know that? What do we know about these attackers like KillNet and others that are attacking specific services? I mean, they got healthcare, financial services, government, infrastructure, things like that. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Uh, so I'm going to answer a few questions here. We'll start off with the industries being attacked. So the most attacked industry is gaming. Then kind of tied for second place is financial services and high tech. Then we have another grouping of manufacturing, gambling, and commerce. And then pharma and healthcare and video and public sector and media are all kind of below that. And so one of the interesting things is these vary by region. So, I said social media is kind of down there at the bottom globally, but if you go into Asia, it's number one.
Hmm.
It's the fastest growing. And then we'll talk for a second about, I'll turn it over. Any thoughts on those industries? You talked about healthcare. I said it's lower in being attacked. The impacts are still huge.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And for those industries, I mean, if you're in that industry, whether you're in healthcare or financial, you feel like the number one target because it's hitting you, it's hitting your organization, or it's hitting your friends
Right.
in the industry. And that's the thing, when you're talking about DDoS as a service, where you can pay to have that done to an organization, it's wide open. I mean, it's wide open of why they may come after you for your
Great
organization.
point.
It may be that they just don't like you. They may be looking for some sort of ransom, hey, or extortion, where they extort you, if you give us this much money, we'll stop our attack. So, I mean, there's a whole variety. And again, I kind of see it from my customers' point of view or my clients' point of view of, like the healthcare one. When that came out, I was sitting, at a healthcare client when the thing came across my aggregator on my phone of the news articles. I was like, oh, yeah, okay, here's another one we need to think about. And we had to go down that conversation with leadership. So, I think it's every
Yeah.
industry can be affected, when you're looking at your Akamai state of the internet reports. That's one of my common ones. I go and I read, and they talk about the different industries that are getting hit. And of course, there's other reports out there that you can go. And DDoS is still a major attack. It's a major impact to organizations.
And you hit on a key thing there. As I put myself into the business model of the criminal, how am I making money off of DDoS? And the most common is that extortion. Pay me and I won't take you offline. And so as I think about that, who's most likely to pay? Who can I make the most from? Small hospital versus large hospital versus gaming. What's the motivation for gaming? I remember as a kid, theoretically, that I could pay somebody $10 to knock a gamer off and win a game. And so, those old days of kind of, it was a little thing that people did for fun and nonsense or nuisance, really has shifted. And now it is a major criminal enterprise. The other thing we've seen though is, I've talked about industry, but let's step back and talk about the other factor that's really shifted things. Last year, the most DDoS attacks were in the United States. This year, over the last year, they're in Europe. That's because of the war. And somebody like Killnet is one of these odd that they're a criminal organization with a patriotic bent towards Russia. And as we know, a lot of the criminal organizations, you don't go to the bathroom where you eat, so they don't attack within Russia. Chinese, don't attack out of things in China. So here we have a criminal organization that is always also looking to try to have a political impact. And so that's what you've seen some attacks against airports. You've seen some attacks against banks. You've seen it against hospitals, where they might have a broader impact. And now you're worried about collateral damage. If my company comes out as against the war or against Russia and for Ukraine, am I now collateral damage and going to have Killnet come after me?
Yeah, and that's a huge one. When I talk to organizations, regardless of their industry or their vertical, I let them know that there's a lot of different reasons why they might get targeted. Um, they might be because it's a direct target. It might be that they're just a distraction. If we get everyone looking at this thing over here, this attack over here to this organization, they're not looking over here. And so there's a lot of different reasons. And you're right. It's if they have a political endpoint, their political objective they're trying to get to, or if they're just flexing. I think there is some of it where they want people to know they're capable of doing it. That way people get afraid. So if you think about it from the the old mindset of, you take down the biggest person in the yard in prison, because that way everyone knows how tough you are. And kind of the same way, you've got these hacker groups out there that are very organized and very capable, but they are still competing with one another because there is a financial gain to them. In some cases, they want to show that they can do this. It would be, I feel like, if someone could clout that they could take down a very large organization or large network at the drop of a hat, well, that puts them a step above someone else in that same arena to get picked to do another attack somewhere. So, I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why DDoS is a major threat to organizations. The one thing I try to get to people is to not necessarily think they're getting attacked for the reasons that they think. They have to look at that threat intel and try to figure out why it's still the attack. They still got to defend against it and recover from it, but they've got to kind of broaden what they're thinking about to really understand the threat landscape.
Absolutely, and it does. I mean, if the senior leadership is considering, do I not want to make a good corporate citizen comment or investment based on Killnet or somebody else potentially coming against me, then they've basically accomplished their mission.
Yeah.
And what is their mission? Is it to be a privateer? Are you familiar with that term
Yes.
from back in the day?
Yep.
So yeah, let's talk about what that is for just a second, because I'm not sure everybody's familiar with that historical reference.
It's a pirate, sort of.
Well, it's a pirate that has been pulled into a national navy.
Yeah.
So if Britain didn't have enough Navy ships in the Caribbean, they might commission a couple pirate ships to act on their behalf. And so now the pirates are no longer pirates. They're part of the British Navy.
Right.
We could go down a long rabbit trail about contractors today. We'll just step back and say, if you're Killnet and you're kind of a criminal, you're kind of an advocate. How much are you guided by the country? It gets really quickly messy, but ultimately, I feel the same impact. If they're coming against me, I'm still offline.
Yep.
So I take why with a grain of salt. As we do these reports, somebody is getting that big bang attack every quarter in every region. Somebody is just getting overwhelmed. And that's the discussion of, okay, am I regulated? If I'm regulated, how long can I be offline? Where does this fit in my investment strategy? Because every year we continue to see DDoS is not going away. It's getting larger. It's getting more complex, more aggressive, and it's just staying around.
Yeah, and DDoS. When you have a DDoS mindset, it's going to happen to you. You should have it in your business continuity and disaster recovery plan. Of how you going to deal with this, how you're going to resolve it. Now, the problem that I see is there's a lot of organizations that they might be secondary to the attack. So they might be attacking a very large cloud provider, and that service may go down, but this organization or my organization or someone, they're seeing the effects because that's where all their resources are. So they weren't part of the attack necessarily, but they had a negative impact. So that's one of the things that I try to get across in my tabletops and in my incident response is there are going to be times that you are the target. There's going to be times that your services that you provide, cloud services or otherwise, are going to be the target. The same effect is negative to the organization. I mean, you may not be able to get to your email, to file shares, to services, to web applications. That still is something you have to consider in your business continuity plan and your disaster recovery plan. Even though you weren't the target, you could still have a negative effect on that.
And let's talk about the new word, resiliency.
Yeah.
And we're seeing DORA come out of Europe, which is a resiliency compliance requirement that I expect to see here in the United States, similar to many of the other privacy and data localization laws that have come out of Europe. Now they're starting to, require resiliency. And cyber is a highly contested environment. And so it's, not necessarily a disaster from a natural occurrence. It's an active, thinking, aggressive adversary. And so
Yeah.
resiliency is a big part of this. So, we've got to think, how am I protecting my customer? Because, that's the layer 7, that's the WAF or web application and API firewalls. WAP. There's, how am I protecting my employee access? Am I compliant? And you brought up that great point of, I'm in a multi-tenant environment. How much risk am I there if the environment's taken down? Less brand damage, but still a lot of operational damage, but other supply chains that could be potentially taken offline and impact my ability to be operational. So all of these are a huge part of that risk portfolio and analytics.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I always talk about the eighth layer, and that's the person, because we do have systems, devices, and networks that deal with life safety and that can have an impact, on the ability to provide that life safety to an individual. So that's another thing that we're starting to talk about is when we have services that have been impacted and that could cause harm to someone, physical harm or life safety harm. That's something that we have to build into those plans, those incident response, disaster recovery, and business continuity and resiliency plans. So that's something that, I think a lot of organizations have not thought about up until now. But I think more and more of them are thinking about that because there's so many infrastructure items, individual things like IoT or XIoT or any of those on the network that we've got to deal with. And sometimes that, if those go down, people could die for a variety of reasons. So, but not to get too deep onto that because that gets really dark really quick when we start thinking about that. But we talk about the industries. What industries do you believe are getting hit the most, or are being impacted the most by the DDoS attacks?
Well, it's interesting when you say impacts. You talk about those industries. I'm a huge fan of the ISACs, the financial services ISAC, fairly mature. The energy, ISAC, again, fairly mature. Defense contracting. You have others out there. Healthcare is an awesome one. Retail and hospitality. I think, what are we, around over 20 different ISACs, those information sharing, great organizations,
Yep.
a great resource to go to for everybody. But as I'm talking to these different ISACs, a lot of them continue to collaborate around, what are best practices for this? How are we reacting? The FBI put out an extortion DDoS, I think maybe 16, 18 months ago. Time stood still during COVID, so it's hard for me to remember, but the we've got DHS and the CISA, so many great resources to go look at what's impacting our peers. Really, part of it comes back down to how critical is it that I be available within the hour? Something like financial services, I want immediate access to my wealth, what little wealth I have, but the money I have in the bank, if I can't get access to it for an hour, how big a deal is that? Energy, I don't want my energy interrupted for an hour. My gaming, I'm probably not as upset about. Of course, I'm not as big a gamer as some of you, so I know some of you take umbrage with that statement. The safety ones probably a lot more so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to remind our audience that if you do have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat, and I'll make sure and those get posted out for Steve to see and comment on. Thinking about that piece. You have your different industries or your different groups that are being attacked. But we've over the last week and a half, 2 weeks, we've had a lot of things on the banking side and the finance side that have been affected. And you're right. I mean, if an attacker wanted to cause disruption, and again, it's not necessarily the direct disruption of taking down a website, it's causing fear in the community around that industry. A DDoS is a great way of doing it, because if the thought was that they couldn't get access to their wealth, as you said earlier, what's going to happen? That's going to cause distrust in the system, and we're going to have a good old fashioned bank run. And I know people hate saying that word, but that, it wouldn't be very hard for an attacker to cause a lack of trust in the community that has a secondary effect of a bank run or something equivalent to that, because it's fear. You're driving fear, and if an organization gets hit with a DDoS and they're not able to get in, you might get afraid. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I will tell you that when KillNet was going against airports, that's a prime example of, I have trust that I'm going to get on an airplane and be safe. And you take away that trust that I have because KillNet took down the airport itself, not the flight system. And so again, even if it's an airport web page and you hear airport, it's huge impact to my trust. And
Yep.
that, we talk about brand, but for financial services, for healthcare, for, critical transportation like that, I think the right word is probably trust. I think you nailed that word there, that, if that starts to erode, if I'm not sure it's going to be there, how big an impact was that?
Yeah, and it's lingering impacts. They people, when they lose trust, it's not may not be necessarily immediate, but it may be several days, several weeks later that those impacts really start showing. So it can be again. We're not just seeing direct attacks against servers anymore. We're seeing attacks on the community, on the population, because those attacks have an effect on people's decision making. And when it does that, that has a direct effect on the livelihood of these organizations.
And so it does go back to, and I love the old saying, trust, years to build, seconds to lose.
Yep.
It is just, it's so true. We always talk about the technology, but to me, most of it's about the relationships, and so as we boil this back down, it is a huge part. And let's say DNS. Do I really think about, is my DNS protected from, this attack of a DDoS? Am I okay with that? And so my web pages and my web portals for customer access are good, but my DNS isn't. And so that's why when we talk about this DDoS, there are so many aspects that it could really come in and attack against part of your infrastructure, can take your whole operation offline. And that's one of the things you and I wanted to share on this, is just stepping back and saying, do I have unacknowledged risk? Is my risk acceptance from 5 years ago still appropriate? Based on these new
Yep.
attack levels, should I go relook at kind of my most people have a service. Is my service still the right service?
Yeah, and I want to talk about that because risk mitigation is a huge piece for organizations. And I'm constantly working with organizations that when I talk with them, they are going on their mitigations that they implemented 7, 8, 10 years ago. So I recommend that, is like, hey, we have new technologies, we have new processes, we have new mindsets coming into, 2023, that we need to really evaluate if those things are still valuable to us in the way we want them to be. So talk to me a little bit about DDoS mitigations, specifically risk mitigation, because it's not necessarily always about the true DDoS attack, because you have these other things, again, business continuity and whatever that you got to think about. But talk to me, let's start with just DDoS mitigations. What options do people have?
So this will be a back and forth discussion just on this, because I think there are subsets. But I just mentioned, those protection services. Let's start there.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing, regardless of anything else, is your attack surface. Where is your attack surface? And again, I want to get away from talking about locations, but I'm going to break my rule and say I've got cloud, I've got multi-cloud, I've got third party, I've got on-prem, I've got legacy, healthcare. Oh my goodness, legacy. And so I've got IoT. What is my attack surface, and where can I reduce that? Where can I control that? Then where can I hide it? Where can I put my surface behind this protection surface? The second is, are my capabilities? We just talked about this record. I would say every year you need a plan to up your protection baseline. Is it 10x? Is it whatever? Is it 3x? Depending on your industry. But every year you need to go check your baseline for capabilities. My provider, what are their mitigation controls? Do they have rate limiting? Do they have geo protections? Am I going to be black-holed in a multi-tenant organization if I'm getting attacked to protect the other members of that tenanted organization? So really understanding what the protection services provide. And then if you've ever heard me talk, I'm going to harp on playbooks and exercises and validation. Yep. And so that's the second part of this. When's the last time you did an exercise to make sure your contact list is up to date? That your playbook of when they're going to contact you, what you're going to do, who's going to do that, and have you validated that? Is your pen test team doing that? Is your red team doing that? Have you hired somebody to do a capacity test and do one of those flood attacks on you? So that whole protection service, I think, is that first level, more of a technical level. We'll probably dive deeper into specific tools, but I think that's the first part that we really need to get our arms around.
Yes, if you don't know your threat landscape, if you don't know what you can be attacked at, that's one of the things, when I talk to organizations and I ask them, how many machines you got on the internet? They don't know. They don't have a way to determine that. Like, okay, how many services do you have out in the cloud? And they don't. And let's talk about this from a framework. The CIS 18, 1 and 2 is, do you have an inventory of your devices, an inventory of your software? And I think soon we're going to have number 3. Do you have an inventory of all your cloud services? Because those aren't quite softwares, they're not quite servers, hardware, but it's something that you've got to know, and you've got to know what is the capability of those services and what is the impact if those services go down. In my previous organization, we got DDoSed, we unplugged the server, and it went away. A lot of organizations can't do that. They don't have the capability of doing that just because the organization is so complex. But I literally went over and thunk, and network bandwidth went down, everything came down, everything went back to normal. And I was very fortunate in that particular situation that it was that simple. I can't imagine any organization out there having a simple response like that and being effective against a full out DDoS attack, either to themselves or their cloud providers.
And in some ways you're reinforcing the DDoS. I mean, if you get black holed, if you black hole yourself, if you take yourself offline, then how do you know when you can go back online? So I agree that, having been in similar situations, I remember those days, and I agree with you. We sound like dinosaurs because those days are long gone.
Yes. I've got a lot more gray in my beard nowadays.
And I guess the next part is, this is highly visible. A DDoS is like ransomware. It's 2 attacks that everybody knows right away because your capacity, your capabilities, your operations are shutting down. And so it's not like, we had data stolen or there's a breach over here or an insider threat. On day one of the investigation, it is public. And so it requires crisis management. And this is a huge part. And so not only do we need those technical controls, but we need triggers. If I'm down for 30 seconds, who needs to be notified? 3 minutes, 3 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks. If I'm regulated, what is a sequence of I notify the CISO notifies the board notifies the regulator. The day they notify the regulator, we might as well put out a press release at the same time. So PR this is complex. And I think DDoS and ransomware need to go through that same drill that we've been doing for data breaches. It's that crisis management.
Yep.
It's how are we being transparent? And oh, by the way, if we're offline, how are we getting our communications out?
Right.
If our customers can't get to our portal, how are we letting people know? Is it through social media? Is it through direct email? Do we have offline email to do that? And so this crisis management and communication plan is critical. And again, it is a playbook. I think the crisis management playbook has third party, it has ransomware, it has DDoS, it has data breach, it has, 4 or 5 of these big plays. And some of them have different timelines and different regulation requirements and, all of that. Thoughts?
Yeah. Well, so I agree with you completely. And I actually, in my organizations that I work with, we create a specific notification playbook because, as you have your ICS, your incident command system, and you have someone that is otherwise responsible for doing your communications, maybe that's your marketing communications person, maybe that's your general counsel, whoever it may be. I want to have that document of everywhere we are required to notify. And that may be your cybersecurity insurance. They may be regulators. That may be law enforcement. That may be contracted vendors. You may have a contractual obligation to notify people. So you have all of that in one document. They say, okay, I've got 24 hours to notify CISA, which is a new requirement that is going to be happening in a lot of infrastructure organizations. You might have 10 hours to notify a vendor, but due to a contractual agreement with them, you may have 72 hours to notify the state. So having all of that lined out in one place, that you have part of your incident command team monitoring that. And you're absolutely right. A lot of people, when they talk about communications, if your network is down and comms are down, how do you meet those obligations? Do you have a secondary process to communicate with people and to make those notifications outbound? In the chaos of the moment during an incident response, you're not going to remember everything. Having those checklists and having those playbooks are super critical. Now, the thing that I always get into is when we do tabletops, and I do a lot of tabletops, a lot of times we focus on the tabletop of ransomware or of a DDoS or of insider threat. And those are great. But we really need to have that incident command system at that next layer up, because there has to be management decisions and then organizational decisions. So when we're talking about a DDoS, not only do we need to have the playbooks and everything in there for us to mitigate the DDoS attack, but we also need to know that executive leadership needs to know, okay, we will not have the network. What do you need to do? We will not have these people because they're focusing on this incident. What do you need to be able to be successful at your role in incident command? And I think that is really what gets them, because when I do senior executive tabletops and we talk about this, we talk about it from a decision-making level, not just a technical level, the tools that we use and the process that we do, but this is what we know now. What do you do? Oh, okay. Now we have a little bit more information. Now what do you do? We have a little bit more information. Now what do you do? So we build this phases of scenarios so that we can talk about those decisions. Because you're absolutely right. I mean, if if you're down for 30 minutes, what does that mean? Who do you have to notify? How much money have you lost? We have some organizations here in Tulsa that they gauge outages by dollar amount per second. When they have an outage, there's a number that they use per second, and of course per minute per hour, of how much they have lost because it is that critical to them. And there's not a lot of there's not a lot of organizations that are mature enough to really understand that piece yet. But I think we're growing, we're getting better because we have to.
Yeah, the classic example is, during that exercise is when you find out, okay, we called in our external forensics before we notified our cyber insurance, so our cyber insurance won't pay for the forensics.
Yep.
And that's why that playbook is so critical.
Yes.
It's just that little discovery during an exercise
Yeah.
is $10-15 million mistake.
Oh yeah.
The last part of this is I want to talk about some of the tools. A lot of what we've talked about to date is, Fortune 5,000, big companies. Ultimately, not everybody gets this. Not everybody gets 5 playbooks. Not everybody gets, multiple tools. And so ultimately, what are the baseline tools we're talking about here? And so, the first is you need kind of a WAF or web application and firewall protection. You may get then that infrastructure protection. You can hire somebody like, Prolexic, which is our capability, which is standalone, or you can go to your service provider is a great place to find that resource. If we go back to that SASE concept of we're trying to do vendor reduction, you may want to find somebody that does both. You need somebody else thinking typically about DNS, protecting, speeding up DNS. So, you could have 3 different tools that you're managing to protect DNS. Obviously, you can get all 3 of those from one provider, or, I call that best teammate. You can go best athlete. You may only have the budget to pick one. And so which one are you going to pick? And that's a matter of your business model. What is the most important thing to you? And then as a CISO, it's our job to make sure that the leadership understands where they've accepted risk. And if you accept risks on DNS, what is your time to implement over there? And just make sure everybody knows those things.
That's a good question. So let me ask you this. We have a variety of people in the audience, and I know that we have a lot of managers and decision makers, leadership, executive leadership, IT security and such. What do you think? And I'm not quite sure how to ask the question. I have it in my head. What do you think an organization needs to use as a threshold to decide that they need to invest in a tool like this? I mean, is it something to the effect of, if we have a DDoS and we go down for more than 30 minutes, that's not an acceptable threshold to us. So we need to implement
material
tools.
Impact. I love the term material impact.
Okay.
That's going to impact our revenue goals for the quarter, for the year. It's a material impact.
Okay.
And I'm gonna real quickly, the person in LinkedIn that said, can you ask a general security question? Yes, you can. The hard ones go to Jonathan's, the easy ones come to me.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
So please throw any questions in, and we'll try to answer them. But it is, every one of us has $10 of problems and $5 of budget.
Right.
And so it's ultimately about making sure that the leadership understands, because every dollar that we take away, we're not investing in new products, we're not investing in better marketing, and so we have to be good stewards
Yep.
and make sure they understand and can articulate the risks. So it's smart risk. We
Yep.
want to take risk, it just should be smart risk. And if I can say DNS could go down for this long before we could remediate. If we remediate under this, we're going to be paying much higher cost. They have to accept that risk.
Yeah, and I think we need to be careful. I encourage people, don't fearmonger. You don't want people, you want to tell them about the risks and make sure they are aware of it, but don't intentionally walk in there trying to cause a lot of fear, because that changes trust in you as CISO. So when I go in, I usually have bad news. That's just kind of the reality of when I have to go to a board. I always want to preface it with good news, but I also want to tell them, like, hey, this is some problems that we've had. But there's a fine line between walking in saying, hey, we're going to get DDoS and we have no protections and it's your fault. You're not giving me any, money for this, as opposed to actually having a real conversation with them and explaining to them in their terms what they want to know about what is that risk and what is that acceptable risk level. Because a lot of times they don't know. I mean, they don't know. You could go in and say, I need $10 million worth of resources to defend against this sort of attack. They will probably, I hope they will want to know, well, what's the likelihood of that attack? What is the impact of that attack? Just doing your regular risk matrix. And then they're going to ask you, what options do we have? What are other industries doing? And that's where I find that conversation is really, really helpful, because I need to know what they're thinking about at a senior executive leadership level or a board level so that I can provide that information to them. But it only happens with good conversation, knowing what both sides need. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there are times in which you accept the risk. It's important to know that. Okay, so we've got the question coming in. Let's see. As security awareness and culture is vital to security programs success, why have not more CISOs pushed for training and even security tools to become accessible? Well, I mean, I think we do push for security training and security tools to be more accessible. I guess I don't really quite understand the question of where it's not
Yeah,
accessible.
and for me, it goes back to $10 of problems and $5 of budget. And so ultimately, if we're asking for training, we the person asking need to make sure we're building a good business case.
Mhm.
And a lot of times we come up and we say we need training. I would encourage you, when you need that, to present it as a business case. And um, some of this we can take on our own. So all we have to ask for is the time. But yeah, that's a complex question for sure.
Yeah. And when we talk about security awareness programs, we one of the things that I try to push, um for accessible in terms of screen.
Oh, correct.
Okay, I didn't catch
Correct.
that. That's a very good point. I don't know that why. I mean, that's
And
having
actually,
ex
I would also say that may be, quite honestly, HR and compliance issue.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
if you're have a disability, accessibility, um, truly something that makes a difference.
But I mean, think about it. You start doing things like multi-factor, a lot of our security tools. You're right. I honestly don't. I know that, coming from higher ed and universities, I did a lot of training with everybody on campus. And I of every background, maybe not, maybe they were blind or maybe they were deaf. Um, the English was not their first language or primarily or at all language. I had a lot of international faculty members that came in and students that came in that, so it was always, I don't want to say a challenge because I always enjoyed working with everybody. I learned sign language when I was in college and I taught my kids sign language, when they were very, very young. And so I always enjoyed working with people and engaging with people regardless of how we needed to communicate. But that's a good point. I'm going to have to think about that and go out and do some research on whose security awareness trainings and whose tools are available in those ways. I don't think I've ever had that question. So, is it Ali? That might be Ali. I appreciate that question. It just says LinkedIn user for us. So I appreciate that question. I'm going to go spend some time and see if I can, get more educated about that. But if you're a CISO, this person said again, but if you're a CISO and you want to reach all your base, accessibility can be pushed in that field too. Absolutely, it can. It absolutely
Yep.
can.
Great point.
And that's one of those things that sometimes we get caught up in the attacks or in the security controls that we don't think about that. That's something I'm gonna put some research into. I appreciate that. And that might be Justin Meerhoff, director of security. He is a director of security. So that's something I'm gonna put on my list to go do some research into. That's a good point. So we've only got a few minutes left. We might even be within 30 seconds. Yep, 30 seconds. They're going to finish this. So thank you, Steve. I thank you so much for coming in and talking with us about DDoS attacks. Everyone, please catch us next week for another episode. If you can find us on your favorite podcast app and on the Voice American Network. We had a great time. I had a great time talking with Steve. This is a great topic. And Justin, thank you for that piece about accessibility and the security awareness. I'm going to see if I can do a show on that. I think that'll be a good show about that. So everyone, have a great afternoon. Have a great week.